and thank you for joining our teaching for 21st Century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise as soon as our very special guest presentation is over, we will get to your questions. With that being said, it is my absolute honor to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Charles Jacobs. He is the president of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, and much more, which I will let him explain. Hi, Charles. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Annie. Thank you for having me, and thanks David Horowitz Freedom Center. Well, I came here to talk tonight about a Jewish civil war happening in Boston. And it's a conflict that's breaking out inside the Boston's Jewish community. And I think it's a fight that reveals important developments in a Jewish world under pressure. Not surprisingly, in many ways, what's happening inside the Jewish community is analogous to America's own culture wars. So here's what's happening in Boston. In every American city where there's even a minimal number of Jewish residents, a Jewish communal group exists to promote good relations with other American ethnic and religious communities. And it's called the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC. Remember that, the JCRC, okay. So in most cities, the JCRCs are composed of Jewish groups from across the spectrum, religiously and politically. And just as with major American institutions like campuses, the media, and now the Democratic Party, Jewish institutions like these JCRCs have been moving steadily, relentlessly to the left. Well, in Boston, the JCRC has moved so far to the left that Jewish left-wing activists think it's time for their next move, which is, like their American left-wing cousins, to try to cancel the strongest traditional voices left in the organization. And in this case, traditional means pro-Israel. So 2 weeks ago, a committee inside of Boston's JCRC met to consider a petition by far-left Jewish groups to expel the staunchly pro-Israel and Zionist Organization of America. If this were a movie, it would be entitled Cancel Culture Comes to Jewish Boston. So they're gonna purge the ZOA from the Boston JCRC. This is driven by two radical groups that are seen by many and would be seen by most everybody on this webinar as hostile to Israel. They are J Street and the New Israel Fund. The focus of their attack is ZOA's president, the very brave and outspoken Zionist Morton Klein, who stands almost alone in the Jewish world against the surging Jewish far left. And they are out to get him. So what you have to know is what it would mean in the Jewish world if the ZOA were evicted from a communal Jewish institution. The ZOA is America's oldest pro-Israel organization. It was initiated by the father of modern Zionism, Theodore Herzl, in 1897. It's been led by Jewish luminaries like Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Expelling the ZOA from a communal Jewish institution would be like erasing the name of Abraham Lincoln from an American public school. And just so you know, here's a very shortened list of what the ZOA does. So 50 years, even before the modern Israel was established, the ZOA began the fight for recognition of the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel. Later, and almost alone, the ZOA opposed the illusionary Land for Peace deal called the Oslo Accords. And almost alone, they fought against Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. And you have to understand, to fight against these things at a time when many Jews had peace stars in their eyes was unpopular and required courage. And many people now looking back understand that these were delusions. These peace deals were delusions that brought more terror and death to Israeli Jews. The ZOA helped spark and played a very big role in moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, Israel's capital. Very important to those of us who worked on the campuses. The ZOA started and it won a 6-year battle to give Jewish students on campus the same protections as other minorities under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, to be free of harassment and discrimination on college campuses. The ZOA opposed Obama's upgrading of the PLO mission in Washington in 2010, and it continues opposing Biden's plans to reopen it. So if you're going to kick the ZOA out of Boston's Jewish communal umbrella, you're going to cancel American Jewry's basic, traditional, pro-Israel political bulwark from New England's Jewish establishment. So now let me tell you just a little bit about the group behind trying to evict the ZOA. J Street is believed to be behind this move for good reasons. J Street is a radical left-wing Jewish organization. It was, you should know, originally funded by George Soros. Soros gave them over 3 years about $750, which J Street lied about and hid until they were caught. They were also caught having people on their finance committee who were on the board of pro-Iranian groups, the National Iranian American Council. But in my view, J Street's biggest sin is to break the traditional deal American Jews have with Israel. Here's the deal, as our president might say. Here's the deal. The deal is that we American Jews can live here in America and freely express our views about what Israel does. But since we don't live there, and since our children do not ride on buses or eat in pizza parlors that can be blown up, or go into the army and risk their lives that way, or since we American Jews don't live there where we can be stabbed to death or rammed by a car or be bombed by anti-Semitic Arabs and Muslims, we pledge not to use our American political power to press you Israeli Jews to do what we think you should do instead of what you have decided to do through democratic elections in order to defend yourselves. Well, J Street broke with that time-honored, long-standing arrangement and is using and intends to use and plans to use the political power of left-wing Jews here through congressional advocacy, for example, to try to force Israeli Jews to make life-threatening and maybe, God forbid, genocidal concessions for peace. So how, you might ask, did such a far-left group get into the Jewish communal tent in the first place? Well, in the case of the Boston JCRC, they were let in through the back door. They got a seat at the table by subterfuge. How? Well, J Street just claimed that it had merged with another small JCRC member organization, even though that organization had still remained in existence. And by doing that, J Street's membership was never voted on, right? They were already automatically members because they had so-called merged with this other group. And that was key because they might never have been voted in, because they avoided by this subterfuge the application process and the scrutiny of a very long list of hostile to Israel activities which they had been involved in, which included, among other things, condemning Israel at the United Nations, giving major platforms to major anti-Israel BDS promoters, and much more. And you should know that J Street has been gunning for the ZOA's Mort Klein from the start. In fact, destroying the ZOA seemed a central goal of J Street. Its launch video in 2008 opened up with a snippet of Mort Klein speaking about the dangers of a Palestinian state. And the video declared that J Street's role is to replace Morton Klein's voice. That was 12 years ago. That was 12 years ago. The video featured a tic-tac-toe board of 9 squares, right, like a Zoom, showing J Street's pro-Israel targets. And Mort Klein was the enemy in the center square. So back to Boston. The radical Jewish left now is using 2 pretexts for its attack on ZOA to expel the ZOA from the communal umbrella here in the hub. The first attack is on Mort Klein for his criticism of the anti-Semitism within the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. That, they say, his criticism of that anti-Semitism makes him a racist and puts him outside the tent. But Mort Klein, who was arrested in Mississippi when he was a young guy, helping to register Black voters, is not a racist. And he's made clear over and over and over that the phrase Black Lives Matter is fine, but that the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement is using a Black movement to peddle Jew hatred. And that's a concern. The ZOA and others have documented mounds of evidence about the Black Lives Matter leadership. I'm just going to tick off a few points, but you can go to the ZOA's website for a huge list of proofs. So 1, Black Lives Matter is a senior member of an umbrella group called the Movement for Black Lives, which is lesser known. And the Black Lives Matter Movement for Black Lives platform and their social media posts and their street demonstrations accuse the Jewish state, falsely, of course, of committing genocide and apartheid. Nice, nice. They advocate for BDS against Israel. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles leader incited the pogrom-like attack in Los Angeles's Jewish Fair district, where Jewish synagogues, schools, and businesses were defaced, burned, and looted. Black Lives Matter participated in an anti-Israel Day of Rage campaign in cities across the United States this last summer. And Black Lives Matter Movement for Black Lives also spouts the libel that Israel trains get this, Israel trains American police forces on how to violently abuse Blacks in America. How disgusting is that? And if all this is not enough, I just watched Mark Lamont Hill, an inside player. I watched him say on video that Black Lives Matter is talking about the dismantling of the Zionist project. No, it's not that. The problem is not Mort Klein here, who has the cojones, that's Yiddish, I think, to say difficult truths about Black anti-Semitism. The problem is the leftist Jews, the Jewish left, and worse, the mainstream Jewish organizations that cower and won't talk about or deal with radical Black or radical Islamist or left-wing anti-Semitism. And by the way, there's a time bomb in the Jewish establishment's embrace of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter worldview is a clear and present danger for Jews. They say that American society is structurally racist, that white privilege is the cause of Black suffering, that white prosperity is racist theft, and that the Jews are the most privileged of whites. That would make us, by implication, the most evil. So how Jewish leaders can avoid these assertions and escape the resultant hatred, none of them say. None of them say. The second pretext for trying to expel the ZOA in Boston is its criticism of the resettlement contractor Hayes. According to the ADL, which does research that's sometimes very good. According to the ADL, the cultures and regions from which Highest now resettles people into America and makes them our neighbors are the most anti-Semitic cultures and regions on the planet. I know this because I've written about it. Studies of Syrian government-controlled school criteria show that each and every Syrian school child is taught that because Jews reject the truth of Islam, Jews are treacherous, designed for elimination in this world and for hell in the next. Now, the United States does ask incoming refugees about their past deeds and statements having to do with terrorism, but it does not inquire what our incoming neighbors think about Jews or women or democracy or gays for that matter. And Highest ignores this issue at every turn. Highest used to help Jewish refugees, but when they stopped, for the most part, needing that service, Highest just kept the machinery running with other folks to import. Why should you shut down your business model? You just change the customers. Both of these matters, Black anti-Semitism and unvetted Muslim immigration, are emblematic of a deepening ideological split within the American Jewish community, which is under mounting assault. And inside the Jewish community, there's a growing concern that these far left-wing Jews who are trying to gain control and sometimes gaining control of major Jewish communal organizations are focused almost exclusively on Jew hatred coming from the right, while they ignore or downplay the animosity from politically incorrect sources, namely from left-wing anti-Zionists, radical Islamists, and Black separatists. So in this context, Mort Klein's forcing a public Jewish discussion of these problems should be seen for what it is, bravely and forthrightly speaking harsh and inconvenient truths to entrenched power. The Jewish left is trapped by its own ideology, and because of that, it has rendered itself incapable of defending the community, a community now under assault by a surge of anti-Semitism coming from 4 clear sources, not just one. Yes, the right-wing white supremacists are here, and they will always be a problem, but also the leftist anti-Zionists who teach all Americans on our college campuses and now in our high schools that Jews here support a racist state. The radical Islamists whose imams can be seen preaching Jew hatred in mosques across this country. And the radical Black nationalists and Farrakhaners whose followers just beat up Jews on the street. So I think the meaning of the Boston Jewish showdown is pretty clear. Here you have a Jewish left, which is seeking to take over mainstream organizations, a Jewish left that feels it must embrace the American left-wing causes, and that embraces the left's so-called victim populations, and which therefore refuses to deal with the raging anti-Semitism surging from politically incorrect sources. That's what you see here. Let me end with a few questions posed by this fight in Boston. What will the rest of the Jewish community, the part that loves Israel as she is, the part that cares to defend Jewry from any attacks, what will they do as their mainstream organizations become agents of the Democratic Party and the left? Will the Jewish far left seeking to obtain control of our communal organizations be able to cancel their ideological foes by redefining what constitutes kosher beliefs? And with such fundamental issues dividing the Jews, can the big tent, the Jewish big tent, still hold contending factions together? If the ZOA is expelled from Boston's JCRC, who will represent the many Jews here in the hub who share Morton Klein's concerns? if they are told that their worries about leftist, Islamist, and Black supremacist Jew hatred are, to use an unfortunate but telling phrase, deplorable, how will that benefit a community under siege? I believe that Morton Klein's ZOA, if it is expelled from Boston's JCRC, I believe thoughtful Jews might be convinced that an establishment that once represented the whole community no longer does. And then they will have a choice to make. Either become unaffiliated or break away and set up their own tent. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for giving us the information that absolutely is nowhere to be found. We do have a lot of questions, but I want to ask you one question before I get to our audience's question. It's my understanding there's a huge difference nowadays in our society. There's a huge difference between being a Jew and being pro-Israel. Am I correct on that statement?
Well, almost every Jew has to be pro-Israel, is pro-Israel, because Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. To be anti-Israel would mean that you'd be against the biggest project in the Jewish world, the project that saved the Jewish world after the Holocaust, that reconstituted Jewish political culture and a Jewish way of life. There are anti-Israel Jews, of course. And, there always have been Jews who've been assimilationists or afraid to bear the burdens of Judaism and of the Jewish people. And in the past, they have either converted to Christianity, or in the Muslim world to Islam, or then when the Enlightenment came, and you didn't have to be a member of any religious group, they converted to Marxism, to universalism. The globalism has been a lure to Jews for a long, long time. And globalist Jews, universalist Jews, love to look down on Jewish nationalists and to say to us, I care about the whole world while you only care about your little people, and I'm so much more moral than you. But actually, it's a cowardly way to escape the burdens of being Jewish. But there have always, yes, there are Jews who are anti-Israel.
I guess what I meant to say was exactly due to cancel culture of our society today, they have created this difference. You don't necessarily have to be pro-Israel, but you can be a Jew, and vice versa. Okay, first question I have here from Richard asking, are the activities of the new Israel Fund for or against Israel?
Well, there are groups who will say they're for Israel. Like J Street says it's pro-Israel, pro-peace. But at the same time, while they smile and say this, they impose, they side with the people who blame Israel for the conflict in the Middle East. And in today's world, blaming Israel for the conflict, for the oppression of Palestinian Arabs, is the new anti-Semitism. So, anybody can be critical of how Israeli policies, but to blame Israel for the conflict puts you on the other side.
Understood. Martin is asking, why were you unable to convince the Newton School Committee that their curriculum was anti-Semitic, particularly since Newton has many Jews in the school?
Well, that's because, that's a good story. By the way, this is happening around the country. Americans know that what's going on in their own high schools is horrific. That people are learning that young kids are learning America, after all, is not such a good place. It's a rotten place. It started off by stealing the land from the Indians. We had black slaves. Our way of life, capitalism, is a premeditated system of theft. That's what's going on about America in the high schools. And in the high schools, funded by Arabist and leftist curriculum groups, There are organizations that create anti-Israel curricula, and they make them pedagogically correct, so they look like they're regular curricula, but they're very, very awful. In the Newton schools, we ran into this problem, as Martin suggests. We found Saudi-funded materials in Boston, in the Newton public schools, that said that Jews in Israel were murdering Arab women in jail. We saw maps used that were fraudulent. We saw all kinds of things that it was like the curricularization sometimes of the New York Times and worse. We were unable to convince the Newton School Board, even though we had all the evidence. And by the way, Camera, a wonderful, preeminent scholarly group, did an entire booklet documenting all of the anti-Israel materials in the Newton public schools. We brought that to them. I brought that to the mayor. This was a political hit job, and it was an inside hit job because it was the JCRC itself that I've just described as being so leftist that told the mayor falsely, no, it's not so bad. The Jacobs Group and Camera are exaggerating things. Don't do anything. Don't worry. We have your back. That was the JCRC. And I can say that the head of the JCRC met in my kitchen in this house that I'm sitting in with a mother of one of the kids in the schools who had brought her child's workbook home and all of the assignments. And she walked this man who heads the JCRC through all of these materials. And he said to me, wow, you know, I'm going to have to change the JCRC position, because we wrote in the Jewish newspaper in Boston, The Advocate, that there's nothing really wrong with this. It's fine. And now I see that we're going to have to change it. I'll get back to you. 2 weeks later, I called him up. He said, I can't do it. My board won't let us be so wrong about this. So that's the kind of Jewish institutions that we're dealing with here. We were unable to convince them because they didn't want to be convinced, and because they had coverage. They had their backs covered by our own institutions that were supposed to be defending us. So now, I mean, well, that's the story.
What are these leftist Jews trying to accomplish? Do they want to wipe out Israel, or do they want to get rid of all the Jewish identity?
Well, there's a gamut, right? I mean, I think that most of the people who would call themselves left-wing Jews think that Israel can be safer if she made concessions. And if she made concessions, they believe that, naively, I think, that since all people are the same and all cultures are the same and everybody wants the same thing, and that the Arabs really want peace and well-being for their children, that if Israel would only make these concessions, that would bring peace. And I think that's naive. Then there are people on the left who don't want there to be a Jewish state at all, or want there to be a binational state. But I think most Jews on the left are more of the naive type.
So they're just misinformed, right?
Well, it's not about facts. It's funny. There are a lot of people who think more and more facts can convince people. I don't think that's actually the case. My experience is not that that's the case. It's about values. It's not facts. The left-wing Jews know all the facts. They just it's what they think about humanity. That's the problem, I think.
Understandable. Okay, next question is asking, is Barack Obama involved with J Street? Actually, I had a question from other audience asking, is it Barack Obama? Is it Clinton Foundation? Who's involved? Who started it? So can you give us a overall of whose hands are involved with J Street?
I know that J Street's goal was to replace the traditional Jewish pro-Israel view in the United States. And their tactic was to do it softly by saying we're pro-Israel, pro-peace. And I know that their goal was to be Obama's Jewish group. I can't tell you if they met. I don't know if they planned this together. I suspect that they did. But yes, I mean, J Street was the cat's paw. J Street was the snake in our Jewish tent. J Street did horrible things. And Obama had meant to make room between America, put distance between America and Israel. And I think J Street wanted that to happen as well.
Well, I'm glad you ended on that note, because next question is kind of related. It's asking, how does the Biden administration fit in to all of this? Because Biden shunned Netanyahu. Well, what is going on really with Biden and Americans Jews?
Okay, so many people think that Biden is not in control of his administration. Many people would tell you that it's really Obama's administration, part 3, because many of the people that Biden is appointing to Middle East desks are Obama's people. And Biden, don't forget, is pressured by the now ever more radicalized Democratic Party, parts of the Democratic Party, the Squad. And I actually fear deeply about what is going to happen in this administration. I mean, you've got some really anti-Israel people having been appointed, and the very fact that Biden didn't speak to Bibi Netanyahu for a whole month is just an indication of what might happen. And this is going to be a long and hard fight for American Jewry, which itself is mostly and wants to be part of the Democratic Party, most of which is part of the Democratic Party. They have yet to learn that the classical liberals that they were and that they lived for, and that was defenders of the Enlightenment values, that classical liberalism is being swallowed up by the progressives. And the liberals themselves are hardly being able to defend themselves against the onslaught of the progressives. You can see this in the New York Times. You can see this with Barry Weiss. You could see this with Jonathan Haidt. You can see this across America. So American Jewry is in for a really, really difficult time. And I think that the fight in Boston gives a window out upon that.
Understood. Okay, here's a question from the comment section. Is there a grassroots Jewish movement to react against this, being the anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic movement? Kind of the same as We the People for Jews.
There are several grassroots groups. Look, here's what happened. There was a new anti-Semitism. We weren't prepared for that. The new anti-Semitism is not like the old. Nowadays, people don't hate Jews because they killed Jesus. They don't hate Jews because we are racial vermin. They hate Jews because Israel is labeled the apartheid state and commits genocide against Palestinians and does all these are all the lies. So the new anti-Semitism was not expected and by the Jewish community, and which didn't know what to do when it came. The main Jewish defender against anti-Semitism is the Anti-Defamation League. When the newspapers in America began to bash Israel almost on a daily basis, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, we started to form a group to watch the media, and we were told that the ADL would be the ones to do it. And we wanted the ADL to do it because they were the voice of the American Jewish establishment. And if Abe Foxman at the time of the ADL told Americans that the newspapers are lying about the Jews again, this time about Israel, that would have had made a huge difference. That would have made a huge difference. But he declined to do it. And from the moment he declined to be the ADL for Israel, that was when a lot of grassroots groups emerged to try to stick their finger in the dike, to try to make up for that lack. There was Camera, and there was the David Project. ZOA was always there. There was Stand With Us. There was Hasbara Fellows, and now there are more and more. But the problem is, yes, there are grassroots groups, but if the mainstream Jewish establishment is not going to do its job and defend the Jewish community against the new anti-Semitism, against radical Islamist anti-Semitism, against Black nationalist radical anti-Semitism, against left-wing anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, the grassroots need to build and build and build and become in competition with the mainstream Jewish organizations.
This one is an interesting question. I actually have this question. Leftist Jews in America, who are a majority in America, will disappear in 1 generation or so because of intermarriage and assimilation. Do you think there will be any Jews left in America and any Jewish organization left in America?
Yes, there will be. And it is true that, the modernism and postmodernism, which is eating away at traditional American values and is having similar effects on Christianity, is having devastating effects on Judaism. And it is true, the intermarriage rates, the no marriage rates, the smaller families, the secularization of American Jews. Jewish organizations have studied this, and the results are devastating. They are devastating. On the other hand, there is a demographic growth in the Orthodox community, which is and was and will always be pro-Israel. And I have to say, anti-Semitism in the streets and on the campuses and in the Congress will probably stoke Jews to be more Jewish, as well as much as it's making Jews afraid and leaving. It will also increase the passion that Jews have for their own people and their religion. So the person who asked the question is right. Those forces are real, and they're devastating.
Okay, here is another one. Can you explain the human rights complex and why there are no virgin birth nations?
Okay, so as I think somebody who asked that question might know me. I went to Sudan to free Black slaves from Arab masters about 15 years ago. And they were jihad slaves. And I found out that, I was a young man, and I was very much in the civil rights movement. I went on Martin Luther King's march. I was a member of the NAACP, and all of a sudden I wake up and I find that there are still slaves in the world, Black slaves. You can buy and sell women and children for $15. In Sudan, in Mauritania, they're inherited like the furniture. So I started a movement with a Mauritanian Muslim, Mohammed Atieh, and he and I launched the American Anti-Slavery Movement. And what we thought was, all we had to do was to reawaken the anti-apartheid movement. All of those people, all of those white people and Black people who marched in the streets to stop apartheid, once they found out that there were slaves that could be bought and sold, I mean, these were people who were, Arab militias would raid African villages, Christian villages, shoot the men, capture the women and children, and take them for slaves. It was horrible. I finally met up with a Christian group, Christian Solidarity International. They had a way to redeem slaves. I went over to Sudan. We redeemed slaves. We brought it back. We showed pictures. We went to Congress. And the human rights community was practically quiet. And I couldn't, so my theory was wrong. We couldn't reawaken the anti-apartheid movement. And I had to think about why that is true. And why that is true, writing a book about that, is really telling. So the human rights community is really in America composed of decent white people who want to say, I'm not a bad white. And so for them, the entire passion is to show white evil and to show that they're against white evil and to show that they're not part of white evil. That's what you find in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that Blacks are owned by non-whites, especially by Arab Muslims, my goodness, this gets in the way of their whole story. They do not want to know anything about this. And, you know, this is a double sin. Its victims are all of those people who are victims of non-Western aggression, like women in the Middle East, right? Women under Muslim rule, gays, Black slaves, Jews, Yazidis, all of those people are left off to the side pretty much by a human rights community that is not about human rights at all, but is about, you know, white innocence, proclaiming of white innocence, expiation of white guilt. So that's the human rights complex. And so the Arabs have learned to play this against the Jews because they play themselves, the Palestinians, as darker skinned people against the white Jews, which is the biggest lie in the first place, because most of the Jews in Israel, the majority now, are from Arab lands and are as dark or darker than many, many, many of the Palestinians who can be whiter, whiter, whiter. So they've learned to play that white guilt against the Jews. That's the human rights complex. What was the other part? You had a second part of that.
It is why there are no virgin birth nations.
Oh, okay. So there are all these charges against Israel. We have an apartheid wall. Well, there's 33 other places in the world where warring people in conflict are separated by walls or fences or barriers, but only we have the apartheid wall. People are worried about Arabs being murdered and killed in war. Well, if you've ever seen any of the data, the amount of Arabs and Palestinians who've been killed in conflict with Jews is like this. The amount of Arabs who've been killed by other Arabs is like this. But there's silence on the part of the human rights community who cries over Arab deaths. Israel is claimed to have been born out of theft, that it stole other people's land, and that's why there's a Jewish state. That is, in fact, not the case at all. It's untrue. At the same time, however, there is no nation state today that anybody can name, maybe somewhere in a Micronesian island somewhere, where the state is not the result of somebody taking over it from somebody who was there before. I mean, look at the history of England, look at the history of France, look at the history of America, look at the history of the Arab countries, look at the history of all of Africa. Every nation state is a system of, I think Florence and Veblen called it conquest proprietorship. I mean, the Israelis are the least of that. They were there, you know, pre-Roman. They were there thousands of years ago, and they came back. So it's, you know, when you only pick on the Jews and you have a double standard for them, that's the definition of anti-Semitism. If the only wall in the whole world that separates people in conflict, the only apartheid wall is the one between Israel and the Palestinians, then you don't care about walls, because there's a lot of walls. You care about Jews, you know?
Yes, that is understandable.
There are no virgin births for nations. No nation just that we have today that I can think of. Maybe somebody can find an exception. That just popped out of the earth and was a nation unto itself with the original population. Didn't happen.
True. since we went there, somewhat went there, and there was a question on the comments that, okay, so under Trump, under Trump administration, obviously the relationship between Israel and America was at its best, and also there was success as far as putting Iran on some sort of leash, as I call it, being, Iran, as many might know, is Islamic Republic of Iran's regime is the number one enemy of Israel in the Middle East. We pushed them back and we managed some peace deals. Now, as we know, things are starting to reverse itself thanks to Biden administration. The first step is let's go back and renegotiate a deal with Iran. What are your thoughts on that? As far as I don't think there's a if, it's a matter of when we will make that deal with Iran, when we will give them the money they need. Then what happens? What happens to Israel?
Well, this is a horrific thing that Biden is doing. He may or may not be able to get back into a deal with Iran. It's the most foolish thing, and it's based on this notion that all people want the same thing, and if you're just nice to them, they'll be nice to you, and if you appease them, they will honestly do what they say they will do, and they don't even do what they say they will do. I think Israel is in for a very hard decision, because if they think that the Iranians are close to having a bomb, and the United States won't stop it, then they're alone and they're going to have to act. And they've made noises that way recently, more and more. It's a very tense time. That's what I think. It's a disastrous mistake for Biden to do that.
I don't know if, I think he's very well aware of what he's doing if he goes forward with this deal. I just don't think he cares.
Well, I mean, again, I don't know how much he's in charge. It's very hard to think rationally about why someone would do such a thing. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, after all, it's not only Israel that's endangered, it's all of Europe, and then it can be America.
I guess it's one of those times that we just have to wait, pray, and see what happens. Okay, we have time for probably one or two more questions. Let me read this one. This one is from Jonathan. He's asking, what is the role of the conservative and Orthodox synagogues in defending Israel against the new Israel Fund supporters and J Street and others who prefer a democratic Israel to a Jewish Israel?
Well, I'm disappointed in the synagogues. There is a group that I'm forgetting, CVJ. There's one group of Orthodox rabbis, or two groups of Orthodox rabbis, who are very good at this. But I'm disappointed in general in both the Orthodox and the conservative synagogues, because I don't find, and we ask all around the country, I don't find rabbis doing sermons on Israel and how to defend Israel and the new anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism from sources that are politically correct. I find them all too frequently ducking the issue, and they would have an extremely important role in educating the Jewish community about these things. And that's what their role should be. And I have to say, I'm sorry to say that I find that most of them don't give sermons and courses and lectures and talks about what's needed here. They have an urgent role to play, and I hope they do it.
I hope so too. Okay, you have suggested, the comment is from Michael, and Michael says, Charles, you have suggested that the decline of the ADL began while Foxman was the director, even before the current director was appointed. Yeah. What happened?
Well, I know everybody, I mean, it's true. The current guy is 100 times worse than Foxman, because he was an Obama operative. And he refuses to talk. You know, the ADL today, they have all this data about anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. They won't talk about it. They went in front of Congress. And I remember we did a film on this. Mort Klein was in front of Congress and he said, he was talking to Jerry Nadler. He said, look, this is a problem. Look at what the ADL data says. These people in these countries are learning from childhood to hate and to kill Jews as a religious commandment, almost, often. And the ADL lady sat there, and when she was asked about it, she said, well, you know, we don't want to talk about groups that in the United States are victim groups. She meant the Muslims in the United States are victim. So we won't talk about it. So there she is, the ADL not withholding, hiding the ADL's data for, you'd have to say, a left-wing reason, not a Jewish reason. Foxman refused to be the ADL for Israel. And what I said was that marked, in my view, the very moment that Jewish history in America changed and turned to a difficult direction. Because had he not done that, had he chosen to use his voice, which was the voice of the community about anti-Semitism, to say and to explain that the media is lying about the Jews again. That's exactly what's happening here. The media is lying about the Jews again. This is a big problem. They've just shifted from Judaism to race, from religion to race to the nation state. That's the only thing that happened. Israel is the Jew among nations. If Foxman had said that, and if he had fought hard for that, we would not be maybe in the place that we are today, backing up and being defensive.
So Charles, I have gathered, I think, 20 questions into just one question for you. Everybody, or at least 20 people, including myself, are asking this. We are wrapping up this webinar. What do people do when we are done? What is the next step for them to do?
Well, don't go home and cry.
I like that.
Okay. Look, I have to say what I think. We're in for a very, very difficult time. Jews have to wake up and understand that our establishment leadership is AWOL. Our establishment leadership is in a trap. They've trapped themselves. They want to be part of a left, which is now kicking us in the teeth. And they kind of know it, but they don't want to let themselves know it. We have to let them know it. We have to stand up for groups like the ZOA, especially like the ZOA, and Camera, and Stand With Us, and Hasbro. We have to help form new grassroots, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish organizations. And we have to challenge the Jewish leadership openly. And if there have to be 2 tents, let's have 2 tents. Let's compete with them. Let's tell the rest of the world that we are not going to go into a dark corner quietly, that we're going to be proud Jews. We're going to love our fellow Jews and our children and our grandchildren, and we're going to fight like hell. And that's what we've got to do. How we're going to do that? We're going to join all of those organizations and more that I mentioned. And hopefully we're going to someday create from those organizations the second tent.
And if you don't mind me adding, as an ex-Muslim, non-Jewish person, I am begging you, fight like hell. You do not want Israel conquered, or God forbid, taken over by Islamic leaders. There is no coming back from that. So I just come to you as a non-Jewish who's an ex-Muslim, and I'm asking you to fight like hell. And Charles, since you're very humble and you didn't say so, I will ask all of our audience who are not signed up to your website, who are not part of your organization, tell them where to go, what to do, and how to get in touch with you and help you and support your movement.
So you can go to peaceandtolerance.org and you'll find our website, and there is a join, donate, help us, sing to us, give us massages,
Give us
happiness,
plugs.
all of those things. So do that. Please do that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Charles. It is always an honor, privilege to listen to you and learn from all of your wisdom and knowledge. So we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And those of you who have stayed with us until now, we appreciate you as well. And remember, all of these webinars are brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you want to support these webinars, all you got to do is go to frontpagemag.com and consider making a 100% tax deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.